Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Webinar Wednesday with the Strengthening Tribal Response to Violence Against Native Women initiative. We will begin the webinar in a couple of minutes to allow others to finish logging on. The line will remain silent until we begin. Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining us for Webinar Wednesday. Today, we will be hosting Tribal Protection Orders in Alaska with the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. Before we begin today's webinar, I'm going to go over some quick housekeeping tips. I know a lot of you have attended webinars in the past and are familiar with the control panel on your right, but here are a few reminders. Your control panel will show on your user screen for the duration of the webinar. To minimize the control panel, use the orange arrow in the top left. All attendees will be muted during the presentation. You will find a PDF of the PowerPoint as well as info about the Strengthening Tribal Response to Violence Against Native Women initiative in the handout section. A video of this webinar and the materials will be made available on our website following the webinar. And the website is www.tribalresponse.org. There will also be an email follow-up after the webinar that contains a survey, if you could please complete that for us. And then there is a question box on your control panel to submit questions and responses, and we will have time at the end of the webinar for any questions. And I will now turn it over to Bonnie Claremont from the Tribal Law and Policy Institute to begin today's webinar.
Bonnie, this is Tammy, and I have just a brief question. There are people texting to say that they can't get on because their internet. Is there a telephone number that they can call to call into the webinar?
Yes, there is a telephone number for the audio that should have come with in the email with their registration.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to get started. This is Bonnie Claremont. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Great. So I want to welcome you all to this webinar to our initiative, the Strengthening Tribal Response to Violence Against Native Women initiative. And the webinar that you're participating in is part of our technical assistance that we provide. This initiative has been going on for an existence for about 2 or 3 years. And this is an OVW, Office on Violence Against Women, funded project to provide training and technical assistance to tribes that don't receive Office on Violence Against Women funding. And it's the purpose is to provide, like I said, training and technical assistance, and to enhance victim services and assist tribal criminal justice systems to more effectively address victim safety and offender accountability. And the Tribal Law and Policy Institute is the lead in this project, and we have our project partners, and each of us has a specific focus within this initiative. And so this is information about the initiative, and the website is located there on the screen. It's www.tribalresponse.org. And there's a lot of really good resources on that website. So I invite you and encourage you to log on to the website if you need information. Our primary focus for this initiative is to help tribes develop response and programs to address domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking. And with a particular focus on helping tribes look at developing shelters for domestic violence, helping tribes develop coordinated community response teams and sexual assault response teams, and also to develop protection orders within their tribal court system. And so that's our primary focus, is those areas, and that's the training and technical assistance that's provided also by our project partners. Next slide. So this initiative is the vision of the Office on Violence Against Women, And they know that, you know, the rate of violence against women is really high in tribal communities and also, of course, in Alaska. So there's a special focus for that, you know, we have the help with our project partner in Alaska, the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. And here's some data on it. I won't read it to you. You know, I just think the data is not as reliable as it could be. I think it's underestimated in the data, but here are some statistics that we have. And again, these are posted on the website that I provided earlier. Next slide. And these are our project partners. We are partnering with the Tribal Judicial Institute, the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, the Alliance of Tribal Coalitions to End Violence, and us, the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. These are the websites that are on this slide, and I again invite you to visit the website. We have our own TLPI website and also the website we created for this initiative. Next slide. We also have partners that are actually providing direct services because, you know, it's really critical that we have people that can advise us, that people that are actually working on the ground. So we have the Emonic Women's Shelter, and we also have the Native Alliance Against Violence that's based in Oklahoma. And we also have the Domestic Violence Program within the Seminole Nation. Those are our direct service providers, and we really value their input because they're seeing what's happening actually on the ground and can offer their advice and their skills and knowledge to this initiative. Next slide. So these are, like I said earlier, these are the training available on these topics: the coordinated community response development in tribal communities, sexual assault response team development, also helping tribes look at developing shelters and safe houses in their communities. Or if they have existing shelters, perhaps they're not tribally owned and operated. So really looking at how perhaps those partnerships can be strengthened, or and then ultimately maybe that tribe could develop their own community-based shelter. We also do training on advocacy in tribal communities, and also, like I said, the legal response focusing on tribal protection orders. We've also garnered and gathered a lot of resources since the beginning of this initiative, and those are located on the website, which again is www.tribalresponse.org. You can also get information from us by emailing us, by posting a request on the website, and you know, we'll respond back to you. And like I said, any tribe that is not currently receiving Office on Violence Against Women grant funding is our primary focus. Or if it's been a while since your tribe has not received OVW funding, or maybe you're struggling and you have a shelter and your shelter is having some difficulties and maybe facing closure, we also can provide some technical assistance for you on that topic or on that issue. There's no cost for the technical assistance, training, or resources for any tribe that is not currently receiving Office on Violence Against Women grant funding. And like I said, there's a request form on our website, and we'll review that at the end again, just so that everyone has that information. Next slide. So this is Title IX of Office on Violence Against Women Act. It was created for the safety for Indian women. And of course, with the passage of this act, it really leveraged a lot of resources for tribal communities. And hopefully with further enactments that tribes can then focus on even sexual assault prosecutions within their own criminal courts. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to our two presenters at this time. And our first presenter is Michelle Demert and also Tammy Truett. They're both with the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. And I want to say a big thank you to the both of you for providing your knowledge and expertise for our participants. So I'm going to turn it over to you all, and you can even do some more self-introductions. Thank you.
Hi, Bonnie. This is Tammy Truett Giroux, and I'm the Executive Director with the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. And I'm going to do the first portion of this, and then Michelle is going to add her expertise and as we go. And I really do want to talk about the whole idea of VAWA, because VAWA has been reauthorized several times. But the important thing that happened with VAWA is Title IX was established for tribes or tribal women. And that was an important piece of legislation because what it did is that it both acknowledged the issues that have been impacting Alaska Native and Indian women for many generations, and it also then was trying in its efforts to help to start addressing some of the disparity that Indian women in particular have experienced through lack of legislation and other lack of protections to help to solve some of the issues and build capacity and to help tribes to start really being able to put legitimate protections in place. And so under Title IX, there were several sections that were involved, and Section 901 are the findings. And the findings were a very, very important piece of the legislation. It included, the findings were very important, including the disproportionate rates of violence. Unfortunately, even though there's not a great deal of accurate data, the data that was being supplied was very clear that there were disproportionate rates of violence against Alaska Native and Indian women and children in other data. But the biggest piece of that is that there was the sexual violence. They had the highest data in the sexual violence, domestic violence, murder, and the other issue that really the Title IX established is that there is a trust responsibility with the United States government with Indian tribes, because that's different than other groups of people. And that was the important piece that this Section 9 in VAWA established, was that there's a trust responsibility with the United States government that then helps the tribes to be able to help their citizens. So if you would go to the next slide. And I think that this question comes up a lot, particularly when we're talking to advocates, is why is it necessary to understand legal aspects that impact Alaska Natives or American Indian people? And I think that that's a long and rather convoluted question that takes a lot more than, my brain to explain, because each tribe has its own unique and established both traditional and non-traditional laws and protocols in their tribes. And it's important because what happens is when we start discussing the fact that the United States government has a trust responsibility with tribes, that trust responsibility means that tribes have more of an equal footing when it comes to establishing and making the laws and the policies that govern their tribal people and tribal lands. Now in Alaska, of course, we have many very unique legal issues that have impacted how tribes can also impart their own laws, and I'm not going to get into that as much because Michelle is going to share some of the pieces with that in terms of the tribal protection orders and some of the tribal court aspects of this. But what it did though in Title IX of VAWA is that it acknowledged that. It acknowledged that tribal government has a trust responsibility, both with the federal government having a trust responsibility to the tribe, but the tribal government also has that responsibility to its citizens, even if the citizen doesn't reside directly on the land that they may call tribal land. And the piece of that is of course in Alaska, there were other legal aspects and policy that have created misunderstanding, but also have created jurisdictional issues that have impacted victims of violence and impacted even how and why the violence is as prevalent as it is. I'm going to go ahead and ask you to go to the next slide, please. The biggest issue that we have to talk about is that tribes in Alaska's history with the federal government, rather with the lower 48 tribes, is very important that having the fundamental understanding that law that impacts the communities. Now, there are 229 federally recognized tribes in Alaska. And every one of those tribes, whether they're members number in the thousands, or if they're members number in the hundreds, or even if they're even lower than that, understand that they have laws that they've governed under for millennial, forever. But with the modern laws, they've also had to implement tribal laws that implement and take into account the laws of the state of Alaska. And again, I don't want to get into all of that because I'm not an attorney, and that isn't necessarily, I'm an advocate at heart. I do know some of these things, but that's why it's important to understand it, because under the Public Law 280 that Alaska also is a part of, that's one of the laws that impact Alaska tribes. They do have concurrent jurisdiction with the state of Alaska. And so working with Alaska tribes, it's really important to understand Title IX of VAWA and how it involves the safety for Native women. I mean, that's really, ultimately, that's what Title IX is about. There's several sections in that title, but ultimately what it's about is the safety for our Native women. And this recognizes the information that there are alarming disparities in American Indian, Alaska Natives, in terms of the response and the impact of that response, because what has happened is that, and why we have so much, apparently the numbers are so high, is that the response has been inadequate for numerous reasons. Whether that's a legal response, whether that's a social response, whether that is a response of the, within the family or within the community or within the state, the response has been inadequate. And because of that, our numbers are so difficult to understand being that high. I would like you, if you could, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this because we only have about an hour and a half. And this is a very complex and much longer conversation that needs to be had and is often had. But we wanted to particularly talk about some of the things under Title IX that are tools that can be used by tribes, particularly in Alaska or anywhere. And so I'm going to turn it over right now to Michelle Demert on protection orders. And I think there will be some time for questions at the end. And so I appreciate your listening. So thank you. And I'll turn it over to Michelle.
Good morning or good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you're located. My name is Michelle Demert, and I am the Law and Policy Director for the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. And I thank you for joining us today on this very important subject. As you've heard, next slide, please. Protection orders in Alaska can look a little bit differently than they do in the lower 48. However, there are some very commonalities in a protection order. What a protection order does is it provides clear direction to law enforcement and to the person who is the subject of the protection order as to what they can and cannot do. It's issued with the victim's safety in mind. So there might be parameters on how close they can come to you, whether it's at work, home, or other places. It sets parameters about what's acceptable behavior. As you know, we live in small communities, and so oftentimes, you know, as a judge, I will get questions about, well, you know, there's a ceremony coming up, and the batterer and the victim are both, you know, wanting to attend. How can we accomplish that? And so we'll put in provisions, no hostile contact, or, you know, no contact, you know, they have to be at opposite sides of the room or the building, and it really, what it does, it takes away the power and control away from the batterer. Domestic violence is, you know, intimate partner violence, violence against a spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend, dating partner, person who you have a child in common with, and it's based on, it's not on anger, it's based on controlling, the behavior is based on controlling the victim and designed to intimidate and harm the victim. And so this is one way that the victim gets empowered by directing what's acceptable behavior, and it takes away power and control from the batterer. He or she do not get to decide on what's appropriate behavior. And then as a result, it holds the abusers accountable. And you know, that's something that's really challenging in Alaska because 40% of our communities lack law enforcement. So if, but in any event, a protection order does provide a level of accountability and parameters for what's acceptable behavior. Next slide, please. So you say, what is a protection order? What does it do? You know, what good is it to me? You know, from a legal point of view, it's what we would call an injunction, meaning it's a temporary order prior to you know, a more full hearing or lawsuit, or it could be considered a restraining order, either civil or criminal court, for the purposes of preventing violent or threatening acts of harassment against someone, like I said, a dating partner, spouse, someone that you have a child in common with, and it's generally issued, a protection order is generally a civil protection order, in which there's a petitioner and a respondent, but it also can be a criminal order in which someone is charged with the crime of domestic violence, and a criminal no contact order is requested, and it's a stay away order for the criminal case. So it's a unique type of order in that it can be initially issued ex parte, meaning that you do it before the judge without the other party being present, because of the extreme danger that someone could be in as a result of threatening or you know, physical, sexual, intimidating behavior. And so the law has determined that it's okay to be granted on a limited basis without the defendant or respondent having notice of it. And then you set up a hearing, and the respondent gets notice, and that's when they get their due process. which is notice opportunity to be heard by a fair and impartial decision maker. So it's really quite an important process that's available to people who are in abusive or threatening relationships and need some protection that, from the outside. Next slide, please. So protection orders can be all on their own, like I said, either a civil or it could be supported in a criminal case. Or if you are filing for child custody or visitation, they could be added to one of those orders as well. And again, you really have to look at what your laws allow and make reference to them accordingly. But like I said, it can be handled first ex parte without the other person being present, and then hearing set within, generally it's between 14 and 30 days, and then that's when the respondent gets to say yes or no as to whether or not they agree with the order, and if they disagree, then the court will take testimony as to what can be done, whether it should be granted or continued on. Next slide, please. So, contents of an order, it doesn't have to be anything specific in terms of what it looks like, but there is specific language that should be included, and it should be clear, concrete language stating what the respondent is supposed to stay away from. And it should meet the requirements of what your tribal law provides. If many tribal courts have protection order provisions in their laws, or maybe they have a restraining order provision if they don't have a domestic violence code. And you want to make sure that you're consistent with whatever laws your tribe has. And in order to meet the requirements of federal law, full faith and credit, and other jurisdictions, there is specific language that should be included around whether or not there was physical violence, whether this is a temporary or a permanent order, meaning that temporary is the ex parte order, the permanent order is after a hearing, and provide specific direction as to where the batterer is to stay away from. So specifically, a lot of courts will give like what's called a 100-foot diameter parameter around someone's house or employment for the batterer to stay away from. It may have provisions around, if you have kids involved, there might be specific information about how transfer of visitation or contacting children can happen. And you want to make sure that it's very specific about that. You want to, if you need assistance with, say, for example, someone is leaving the family home, and maybe, the victim wants assistance with getting what's called a civil standby, in that, having law enforcement come by and maintain peace while the victim gets his or her belongings from the home and moves elsewhere. Or maybe the victim is being granted the temporary use of the car, or and they need assistance in getting that. So you want to make sure that you have specific parameters as to what will be included and how it will be enforced, because let's face it, we don't stay, well, except for right now, I suppose, we don't stay in one place. People travel. So people could be traveling from the village to Juneau, people could be traveling to Anchorage, Fairbanks for medical treatment, and that protection order is good wherever you go. And so one, you want to have the victim always have a copy on it, his or her person, so that if the batterer violates it and they call the police, that law enforcement will have notice of it by that copy if it's not already registered with the state. Next slide, please. So tribal courts in Alaska. So for the last 4 years, I have been the elected Chief Justice for Central Council Tlingit and Haida Indian Tribes of Alaska. And so in that capacity, I've had a lot of interaction with our courts in tribes in Southeast Alaska specifically. But I've also had the privilege of going to Tanana Chiefs Conference and participating in their very well-run and developed judicial training that they put on every year or two. And you know, there's quite a few tribal courts in Alaska. I think there might be just under 100, and a lot of them have different priorities as to what they hear and what they don't, because of, you know, long history of issues that I won't get into here regarding Public Law 280 and funding for our courts in Alaska. But, you know, just want to make sure whoever's on the line knows that tribal courts are alive and well in Alaska, and they are in fact growing because, let's face it, the Western court system's in crisis. You know, they're not meeting the needs of our communities. You know, with 40% of our communities without law enforcement, you know, a lot of our cases don't even get the attention they need by the time law enforcement get to our community and actually consider whether or not to charge someone. So, so who's better to address these issues? Our communities. And so that's why tribal courts are so powerful in terms of being able to provide the safety mechanisms that communities need to help with their healthy and safe goals. So next slide, please. So there are 574 tribes in the United States, and 229 of them are in the state of Alaska. So I think that's pretty important to consider. That's about 40% of the tribes in the United States are located in Alaska, a Public Law 280 state, and another large set of tribes are in the state of California, another PL 280 state. And so why do I say that's important? Well, because Public Law 280 transferred to the states whatever jurisdiction the federal government had at the time, and this was done in the 50s. And so as a result of that, Public Law 280, it was an unfunded mandate to the states, and as a result, many of the states that have that are Public Law 280, there are 6 mandatory, and then the rest are can be partial. They didn't put a lot of resources in tribal communities to fulfill those obligations that the federal government imposed on them. And so anyway, that was a short digression, and I'll get back on track here. Next slide, please. So tribal courts, as I mentioned, are local options for providing some sort of accountability for holding perpetrators responsible for their behavior. You know, if perpetrators are not held accountable, their behavior tends to escalate. You know, you see that in the lethality studies that show that, you know, that will look at what types of abusive behavior is happening. And on the lethality scale, if someone is strangling a victim, guess what? The next step is death. And so, so it's really important to pay attention to what behaviors abusers are exhibiting, and it's equally important to hold them accountable so that it stays in check and they get the need and the help that they need. I mean, let's face it, our men, who are the majority of our abusers, have also had a long history of historical trauma, and it doesn't excuse any behavior. But the fact of the matter is, they probably need some desperately needed treatment and help as well. So, and they stay in our communities, and so we're all invested in finding solutions for getting our community healthy and getting people on the right track. There's also state options. Numerous, there's 4 districts of in the state of Alaska, and 4 judicial districts, and the judicial districts are located in the hub communities like Juneau, Anchorage, Fairbanks, and then there's magistrates who hear cases in the smaller communities. So there are state options as well. Next slide, please. So this is a slide that it comes from 18 USC 2265, and it is very clear that tribal courts have jurisdiction for issuing protection orders. So you in your tribal government have the full civil jurisdiction to issue and enforce protection orders involving any persons, including the authority to enforce any orders through civil contempt proceedings, to exclude violators from land, and to use other appropriate mechanisms in matters arising anywhere in Indian country of the Indian tribe. And again, it is a little bit confusing in Alaska. Excuse me, I need to take a drink. Because of this Indian country issue. As you all know, there was this case, State of Alaska versus VANW, which was a Supreme Court case that essentially found that there is virtually no Indian country in Alaska. And so, so this reference to Indian country might make it confusing for us, but rest assured, your tribal court have the ability to issue a protection order anywhere that in your jurisdiction, and the state and federal government are supposed to enforce that. Let's see, next slide, please. So again, just to recap, there's 2 pathways for getting a protection order, and those are shown here, either the state or the tribe, and that could be either for domestic violence protection orders or domestic relations orders. And what are domestic relations orders, you ask? Child custody, dissolution, anything that impacts the fabric of your community is something that could potentially be part of your jurisdiction. Next slide. So, sorry. So tribal courts, they really are vital to the safety of our communities. As I mentioned, and it's my, I guess my favorite statistics to quote because it has such potential harm for our communities. For our communities not to have 40% of them not to have law enforcement, or to have VPSOs who are there part-time, or have law, state troopers come in 2 weeks, 2 off, 2 on, 2 off. I mean, let's get real. The perpetrators and the whole village know when someone's in town and when someone isn't. And also, our VPSOs, God bless them, they often are, put in situations where they are isolated. They don't have any real backup. They hadn't been allowed to carry guns, even though they have the same training as police, with exception of maybe 2 weeks. And it, it's just really, it's sort of a dangerous situation for them. But many of them sign up for it because they are committed to the safety of our communities and are doing the best that they can. And some of them may not be from our communities and may not know what they signed up for. They may not know how to interact with a village community and how to get to know people, because really, in order for the communities, our small communities, to trust the VPSOs, they need to know them. They need to know who they are. They need to know where they come from and what kind of people they are. Otherwise, they're not going to call them. But anyway, tribal courts, they play a vital role in the protection and preservation of sovereignty, because it's one mechanism for addressing what is important in your community and how to go about enforcing it. So it provides a forum for interpreting tribal laws, rules, and policies that are consistent with customs and traditions of the tribe, and it prevents state and federal courts from getting involved, and it provides a forum for the enforcement of orders from outside jurisdictions as part of the larger legal landscape of the United States. So it's really an important part of any governmental structure. And but a lot of our courts or tribes in Alaska haven't been able to have tribal courts because there's no funding for them. Up until maybe 3 or 4 years ago, tribal courts in Alaska received $0 for tribal courts, and certainly didn't get any money in their self-governance compacts because of federal laws or policies that prevented any money from coming in that way. And so there has been Public Law 280 state money for tribes. And so a lot of tribal courts in Alaska have taken advantage of that money. And if you don't know about it, please ask us about it, because essentially what it is your tribe asks for a court assessment, and with that, it gets you in the queue for the BIA to provide a court assessment, whether or not you have a court, never had a court, want to have a court, whatever. And then it allows you to request funding to start your court. They have money for training, they have money for Violence Against Women Act, they have money for court operations, and you can request money every single year. But again, it's you had to request it every single year. People don't, it's not highly publicized, but it is money that's available and should be taken advantage of. And I have several templates of things that you can use and personalize for that. it's just something that we all should be taking advantage of because we have such desperate needs. So next slide, please. So why is travel justice important? Well, travel justice, as I mentioned, is an opportunity for people, for communities to express and prioritize what is important in their communities. And it also is an opportunity to really address the issues that are important within a community. And it doesn't have to look Western at all. It should be Indigenous justice based. That, of course, stresses relationships and responsibilities rather than individual rights. But every individual should have the dignity. I know a lot of, I'm like any other Indian family, I'm Tlingit, and I have family who have had their struggles and have had to go before state court judges, and they ask me for help in getting answers, and I'm just flabbergasted at the lack of just representation, issues that are addressed, that are highly relevant to a judge making a good decision. And it's really disheartening to hear that our people are put in such a position before someone who may have no knowledge, no cultural awareness of their situation. But I'm not trying to say that all state judges or employers or state magistrates are bad. I'm just saying that there's a fair amount that really do not understand our communities or our individuals or our history. So they're making decisions for us in a vacuum. So anyway, in it's just really, it's a time where your voice can be heard. It's hopefully your tribal court is holistic. But one thing, next slide, please, is that it's rooted in, your values. This is our values, our Southeast values. And I know that I saw a map recently where there's tribal values for each region that have been sort of identified, and I hope I can find that map someplace because it's awfully cool, because it reflects who you are as a people and how you interact with each other, and it sets the tone for what sort of justice could happen in your community. And so this is our Southeast traditional tribal ways of life. And if you look at some of our tribal codes at Tlingit and Haida, you'll see, like in our child welfare, we have a very detailed listing of what's important for consideration, clan considerations, community considerations, etc. And you wouldn't find that in state. And so, that was our opportunity to define what was important to us and what should be considered when a case comes before our tribal court. You all can do this as well. Next slide, please. I touched upon this previously, but when you travel, the court order should be travels with you, and it should be enforced wherever you are located. And every jurisdiction is to give you full faith and credit of that protection order. Next slide, please. In Alaska, there is a civil rule 5.1b, which states that you can file these with the state, who will then register it in the state database, and it provides what that sort of process looks like. But I just also want to say that it's not required to register or have in a database for it to be enforceable. So while I think it's advisable to do that if at all possible, it's not required. And, you know, whenever years ago, I've been a tribal court judge for, oh gosh, I don't know, 15 plus years now. And years ago, before we had a good working relationship with the state or with local law enforcement in some of the communities that I've served, I would have the court clerk give the petitioner, the victim of who was being protected, maybe 5 or more certified copies of the protection order, so that her employer had a copy, her the kids' school had a copy, things like that, because excuse me, sorry about that. So it's just, you know, these are things that, you know, you want to make sure that whoever is the subject of the order receives maximum protection. And also, it's a way of getting your tribe out there to let people know that, you know, this is something that you've prioritized as a community and you think is important for providing protection for your community. But maybe you don't have that ability. So then check with, like, I know in Southeast Alaska, even if a tribe has their own individual tribal court, they still will use Tlingit and Haida for protection orders. You know, or in our case, any of our citizens are eligible. Any of our 31,000 citizens, regardless of where they are located, can request a protection order, and we'll consider it and issue it if appropriate. So, you know, so check in with your regional areas too to see if there's any sort of intertribal working group or something that could help with this, because it's important that people get protected. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, enforcement, registration is optional and it is not required for it to be enforced. Next slide, please. So in apologies, here's my 40% statistic again, but you know, if you ever talk to non-Alaska lawmakers or are providing any information, you know, this is a really good statistic to demonstrate, because, you know, people in the lower 48, they call 911 and can expect someone to show up within minutes. We call 911 and that might be for emergency health services, and we might have to call a dispatch number for law enforcement. So, you know, people just don't understand the differences that we face in Alaska because we do not have that centralized 911. And our law enforcement can be hours or days away. So if that's the case, who's going to enforce the order? You know, because I don't want, as a judge, I always think about this. A protection order is just a piece of paper, and it's a piece of paper that tells someone what they can and can't do, and it tells other parties, i.e. police, what they're supposed to do. But if there's no police, what do you do? And so this is a real issue that I would encourage you all to explore with your councils and other tribal leaderships about who will enforce a protection order if they're issued without any law enforcement. Because you know, it's the safety of our communities. It's the health and welfare of who we are, and gosh, you know, I'm going to digress again for a minute, but I've done a fair amount of federal law educating in DC the last few years, and very little has changed back there. And it seems like I'm telling the same story, but I'm adding statistics. You know, there's been a new death. there's been a new tragedy that I add to my list of stories to share. And but I'm making, the same educational request to please provide protection, provide resources, provide um, just whatever is in the various pending federal legislations right now. And it's very hard. It's very hard to do, knowing that these are real people whose lives are impacted by this violence that is just a statistic for a lawmaker. So these are our communities. So I encourage each of you to place a high priority on what you can do for your community and have those hard conversations. Have a coordinated community response team, have a multidisciplinary team, meet monthly, even if it's just all volunteer, just to talk about what's important in your community and how to go about, making it safer. You heard earlier from Bonnie that they provide a high level of technical assistance on various grant programs, and the federal government gives them money to help tribes do things. So call them, ask them for help. But in order to do that, your community needs to understand what is most important to them and create, just some sort of plan to let technical assistance providers know what it is that you're looking for, and then they can help you develop a more formal plan. So that's really important. I'm going to pass it back to Tammy, and I just really thank you all for your time today.
Hi, and thank you. It's always really informative to listen to Michelle be able to line out much of the things that we have access to for protection, but also to then bring it back to the reality of, if you are able to implement it at the tribal court level, how are you going to enforce it? And I think that, having worked as a both advocate, tribal court clerk, administrator for a very long time for small tribal courts, I think it's really, really important, and an equal worker, I think it's really, really important that we make sure that the tool that we're trying to implement to help keep someone safe is the tool that the community is willing, or the tribe or the court is willing to stand behind. And I think that that's the main really kind of nuts and bolts issue. So if that means community and response, or community, however the community wants to define that you have first responders, that you have certain things that already roll into place when things happen in your community, especially if you're small communities and you don't have access to more paid first responders, so to speak. So it's really, really valuable and important to understand, okay, so we already do this, we just have never formalized this. And I think that we've seen that a lot recently with a lot of COVID emergency orders that tribes have put in place, because tribal authority, there is actually a very real thing. And I don't know if all tribes, don't necessarily have had to exert that. And I think the biggest piece that we have to understand is that we also have, as tribes and tribal entities, really valuable pieces to keep victims safe in our communities. And I think it was well put by Michelle and Bonnie as well. The fact is that it's a priority of the community, and that's when it shows. So a priority of the community may be tribal court. Okay, well, if it's tribal court, is it tribal ICWA cases, or is it tribal child protection? Is it tribal court in terms of dealing with misdemeanors and other kinds of crimes that may be happening in the community that aren't necessarily dangerous crimes, but they're very irritating and agitating, and they're crimes that, they're taking people's belongings, or they're destroying property, or whatever that might look like? Are they crimes that you're trying to stop alcohol or other drugs that may be impacting the community? Is it domestic violence? Is it other types of violence that are impacting the community? And so these are the kinds of things that the court can take into consideration when they're both establishing what type of court system they may have, but also they can step back and say, but what kind of community are we trying to support, basically? Because oftentimes in the small tribal communities and other tribal communities around the state and around the nation, that's all there is. Alaska tribal courts do look a little different than tribal courts possibly in the lower 48 because of some of these policy laws and other kinds of jurisdictional issues that have been briefly discussed. So I think it's really, really valuable. And that right there, when we start talking about resources, going on to the next slide, I always want to start with the fact that we have to identify the actual resources in our community. And sometimes that isn't that easy. For instance, in my community, for instance, so we don't have a cop. We do have a health aide. We don't have a 911 system, although I understand that there is a statewide, or not statewide, but in certain regions you can call a 911 and get a state trooper dispatch somewhere in the state. It's definitely not in your community. We don't have things that are necessarily, so to speak, what we would call, a regular, like we can't call out the fire department because we don't have that. And it's those are the kinds of things that we have to take into consideration. And so I think that one of the things that we have to do then is that we have to talk about, okay, what do we have? Okay, so we're a small community and we've been doing all these things for a very long time. And that's where we talk about, when we talk about community response, that's what the community is. We've been doing this, so we have to identify who has been the responders. Who do we call when there's a problem? Who do we go to? Do we go to the tribal? If you have a city, do you go to the city? If you have an elder that has been more of a person of influence, do you go to that person? So I think that it's really important that we have to identify that. And so with resources, oftentimes we'll have people call in communities and say, well, what do you do if you have a domestic violence? And the person on the other end of the phone might say, well, we could call the troopers. That's not actually always the first response, to be honest with you. But who we call my auntie. And then my uncle and my auntie will take that person in. So we have to be realistic about what our resources are, because most of our communities do not have shelters. There are a couple of our tribal communities that do have shelters, and that's a really valuable resource and a very critical resource for a first response. But really, realistically, the resources are usually located in hub communities, whether that's Bethel, whether that's Nome, whether that's Kotzebue, Dillingham, Valdez, wherever that might look like for your area. And getting that person there's another bit of a kind of conundrum in terms of how we do that. So it's identifying all those things. But you do have the Alaska State Troopers in most hub communities, not necessarily in villages. You may or may not have local law enforcement, and that's usually someone you would call if, of course, you had something and needed something locally on a resource. There are Alaska resources online that can be accessed. The Alaska State Tribal Court Toolbox that has some sample forms, kind of sample tribal court toolbox, public courts, things like that. There's also, and we have showed, it's on the website, or the websites and the access to these websites are on the slides, tribal protection order resources. And I think I have to always repeat this because tribal protection orders are not always the first go-to tool that some tribes will use. And because of the enforcement, because it is a piece of paper. But it is also a valuable tool if if for some reason you think that'll work in your community, or you have the availability or accessibility. But I also have to really continue to repeat what Michelle said, is that it's probably a good idea to register it with the state, but it's not required. And it still then is an enforceable, full faith and credit enforceable document. Alaska Legal Services, and they're a very good resource for people for legal information. And they do give information based on income. So if you have a lower income, the only thing that would, if for instance, if two people are going there about custody, for instance, the only thing is if the other party that is involved in the possible custody has already had contact with Alaska Legal Services, they will not be able to represent, you know, the two parties, because it would be a conflict. The Alaska Tribal Court Directory. Now that was just really established in 2018, and that's a really good resource because until recently there hasn't been as many tribal courts. And remember, every tribal court operates in its own, under its own jurisdiction and codes and what it's established as their priorities as a tribal court. Most of our tribal courts in Alaska don't require legal assistance in terms of lawyers and other representation that way. It's more of a community type of paneling, but all courts are run a little differently depending on the tribe. And then, of course, the resources online, you can find out, you know, the Alaska Tribes, which has their contacts under alaskatribes.org. So those are online resources. And again, as we've stated, in Alaska, tribes are under-resourced. There's many disparities. Unfortunately, during this COVID time, it's almost like the disparities have been even more blaring types of disparities. So I think that it's really important that we acknowledge that, but also really value and try to identify the resources in our communities that have been active all along. Next slide, please. The other issue that we, full faith and credit resources. So there's also access to civil protection orders and the guide for in practice. And I also think that there's resources for, there's many different, through NCJ, FCJ, they have a lot of really awesome things that they're on their website. And the Passport to Safety, Full Faith and Credit, a judge's bench guide. The National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, Domestic Violence and Publications. My screen is, yes. So the biggest issue that we have is that there are things available. I think we have to definitely dig for them sometimes, but there's also people that you can reach out to. And the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, TLPI, there's all sorts of resources that are available to you all for as simple as questions, if we can answer them, or we can try to direct you in places that can answer those. And I wanted to go ahead and leave enough time for questions, and so I'm going to go ahead and stop now.
Abby, is there any questions that came up?
There's no written questions. We have one person, Nancy, who has her hand raised. I can unmute her so she can ask her question.
Okay.
All right, Nancy, you should be able to ask your question now.
Nancy. Oh, Nancy.
All right, we can move on to the next question. Katrina, you should be able to ask your question now.
I know that down in Anchorage, we have the Family Wellness Warriors initiative. This for even the abuser. Would TCC ever offer that?
This is Tammy, and I don't know if Tanana Chiefs would offer that. I'm not, you know, I'm not with them in terms of the interior. You know, I don't, you know, I'm sure that villages can access wellness warriors through different, whether they do that through, contract or whatever. That's a bigger question though, is that type of programming for people that are abusing, because there isn't a whole lot out there. And, I think that that's a piece that we're definitely missing, in terms of trying to bring this full circle to help people change behavior, right?
Yeah.
And I think that that's definitely conversations that are happening in different places around the state. But as far as I know, I don't know of anything specifically through Tanana Chiefs Conference. I do know about the wellness warriors down out of Alaska Native Medical, or THC, ANTHC. I think there's other pockets of communities that are doing work, trying to, in circles and other aspects of more traditional types of re-education, so to speak, for
Yeah.
possibly men or people that have been abusing, whether it's men or women. And so, and I think it's important. We need to definitely continue to try to help support and develop those kinds of programs.
And because I think, I think talking circles are a lot more culturally based, and I think they would be more accepted up here, I think. Um, and also I was wondering, is transportation a major issue for women to leave the village, getting out of the village? I mean,
Oh,
is there?
absolutely. No, absolutely. And it just, again, depending where you live. But transportation is huge, and I think that, and this is just at a person, this is just an observation. During this COVID-19, with the collapse of some of our infrastructures in terms of airlines and things like that, plus all the emergency travel orders
Yeah.
and things, plus the fact that there's a lot of stay-at-home orders, and so maybe local safe homes in communities aren't as available. I think one of the things that has happened, of course, is that people are just staying home because they have no other options. And I think that shelter programs are, of course, having more screening efforts, and they have to put in place isolation and kind of, what do you call it? Not isolation, but quarantine, separate quarantine areas. So it's challenging, especially coming out of villages, plus the cost to travel, even when we had regular services. But if you have to charter a plane, that's thousands of dollars sometimes, depending on where you live. So, and again,
Yeah.
trying to find relatives or other options for people is also one of those kind of community resource responses that I think are also happening in communities too.
Yeah, and I would just like to say, this is Michelle, and there are grants available that address transportation, and so I hope that tribes will consider applying for them. One is the Family Violence Services Prevention Act, which provides tribal governments with the ability, or tribal designees, to provide transportation costs. OVW might have, I'm not an OVW expert, but they might have grants that would provide that. Victims of Crime Act grants, you might be, if your tribe receives that funding, there might be some eligibility there. So, I just really encourage you all to look at what grants you have and what's allowed, and because, as we know, transportation costs are so high in our villages, and especially depending on the time of year, what would be available.
All right, we have one more question from Francis. I will unmute you. Oh, Francis, it looks like you have yourself muted, so I can't actually unmute you.
Okay, I think I got it. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Beneficiaries, thank you. Francis Andrews with Tlingit and Haida. Just a question for you, and I think I might know the answer to this, but I'm really curious, especially in Alaska, with a lot of the tribes that may be closed or not fully in operation during COVID. Is it reasonable, or have you been aware of or familiar with any tribes that are offering protection orders for tribal courts offering to issue protection orders for tribal citizens from another tribe? I ask the question because I just think it would be such a valuable resource. So that's part one of the question. And part two of the question would be, if moving into the future tribes chose to do something like that, do you think from any of your expertise that there would be funding available to help support a domestic violence docket that was available for other tribes? I know that was a can of worms, but it's something that's been on my mind after joining some of the support calls from the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. Chish?
So I'll take part of it, and then Tammy, you can take part of it too. This is Michelle, and hi, Fran. So, in terms of what a tribe has the authority to do, you really have to look at your tribal constitution and documents as to who is covered by your laws, because that could, one, be a limiting factor. The other, here's the murky Indian country issue is, I'm also a judge in Washington State, and they have reservations. And so anyone within the reservation boundaries that has, any tribal person, whether they're a member citizen of that particular tribe or another, is eligible for a protection order. And so because they have a territorial jurisdiction component that is provided. So, again, you have to look at the subject matter. So look at your constitution and laws, and then to look at your territory and whether or not they'd be covered. As far as, a centralized protection order, I think that any tribe could band together to provide jurisdiction and judicial services to their citizens. And so if a village in the Bethel region wanted to contract with Tlingit and Haida to provide, a judge and personnel, essentially, if you will, and that tribe in the Bethel region supported that sort of relationship, then you would be eligible for that. In terms of a centralized repository or court, that just gets really murky because of that. There's 229 tribes in Alaska. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but and Tammy, do you have anything else to add?
Well, yeah, I think it's murky in all kinds of way, but that's what I was thinking, Michelle, is the intertribal court agreement. I think there's a lot of courts in Alaska that are looking at intertribal court possibilities in order to, particularly when we have small tribes with so many relatives within those tribes, so that there's a fair and equitable way that people can really have their courts be impactful and effective. And so those were kind of the things that I was thinking about too, Francis. And I actually think it's not a bad idea, because that would then help with capacity for some of the smaller courts that don't necessarily have all of the staff and other capacities to help implement those kinds of, protocol, or so to speak, and things that might be helpful, particularly in protection of victims, as far as I'm concerned. And I know that didn't answer your question, Francis, so just
Chish,
All
I was just going to really quickly add that it did answer my question, in that it started a conversation that I think some of us should be engaging in. And I think that, as different as we are, all 229 tribes in Alaska, when we face times like we have with COVID and some of our smaller communities just completely shut down, I think that we can hold each other up And so whether we have this conversation in the next 30 days, or if it comes out in the next 2 to 3 years, I think the closer that tribes can work together, I think the stronger that we're going to be. So you can put my name in a hat as someone who would be interested in having that conversation. So Gunachish, I appreciate your answers.
All right, we have a couple questions that were sent in. Tammy and or Michelle, can you touch on elder protection?
Michelle, do you want me to take that, or?
Yeah, go ahead. I don't feel as strong about my knowledge in elder protection cases in Alaska.
This is a really important question, because the fact is that elder abuse is, as we know, is prevalent, and a lot of times it's more about financial abuse and neglect more than physical abuse, although the physical abuse is also prevalent. And tribal court has the ability to put in code and ordinances and laws that can protect their elders. The state of Alaska elder abuse laws are there, absolutely. But oftentimes when someone's being abused and you report it to adult protection, they can investigate that. And when there's a real shortage of people that do investigate that, and when they do, they have to get the elder to basically state that that's true or not true. And they do find oftentimes that elders, they love their families. And so even if they may not understand or recognize that this kind of abuse, whether it's financial or neglect or things, are really happening and don't really want to tell on their family. But at a tribal level, when you see this happening as the tribe, you have a little bit more leeway, so to speak, to protect your elders, because you see they're vulnerable, you see that this may be happening to them, you see that they're maybe not being helped or taken care of in a way, in a manner that needs to happen for that person. And so the tribe can then investigate that and put some safety precautions in place for the elder, whether the elder you want the elder to be able to feel comfortable with the tribe's intervention, but they could do it without, if that makes sense.
All right, and then we have one question from Kelsey, and then Katrina has a follow-up. So Kelsey, I will unmute you.
Hi, thank you. So Tammy mentioned that tribal protection orders might not be the first tool that tribes use when there's a domestic violence issue, and also reiterated that it is just a piece of paper, and this is something that I've been looking into and doing more research on. And so I was just curious about what some of those options might be, and hoping you could explain a little bit more about coordinated community responses.
Okay. And I know that okay, two-part question. And Bonnie has a lot more information about coordinated community response, because I look at it a little bit differently. But what I do think is that protection orders are a definite tool. I think the first tool always is safety. So how are we going to get that person to feel safe, be safe, and then continue to feel safe? And so there's a lot of options that can happen, whether that's at the local level, whether that's at the tribal level, whether that's at, or you use resources that are state available through the state, whether that's a domestic violence shelter, whether that's a shelter group, any of those kinds of things that the person that's being victimized is comfortable with. And that's the priority, is always making sure that you're trying to help that person make the decisions that's going to be the best for them and their family, right? Local community response, and again, I don't know if we have time to go into it, but that can look a lot of different ways. You can have a formal community response that I've identified, whether that's through a tribal advocate and healthcare, and or if you have law enforcement, and or an elder or somebody in the community that's very active in helping with any kind of first response. And you can have that more formalized, or you just have a level of, if this happens, this is who we call and this is how we handle it. And that's a really quick answer, because I think we're out of time, but I wanted to at least try to touch on it a little bit, and I'd be happy to talk with you more. And I think my contacts are on here.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Katrina has one last follow-up question and then we'll finish up the PowerPoint.
Tribe, I know it says the tribe follows, certain laws, and they follow like traditional law, like as in unwritten laws, like for elder abuse. I mean, it's a common thing. You respect your elders, right? I mean, would that be an unwritten law?
So
Or
this is Michelle, and
Okay.
I'll answer that.
Okay.
So yes, and generally, but you want to be careful that you're not seen as being arbitrary or, but I think what you always start with looking at what your Constitution says. And your Constitution generally will provide the framework for what the tribal council has the authority to do, and what if a court is mentioned, etc. And then look at what if you have a tribal court code, what they're authorized to do, because some courts have what's called inherent authority to take certain actions. And that means that you have the ability, when someone requests something from the court, to act on that request based on that inherent authority. So, so yes, the short answer is yes, but always exercise caution, because you don't want to. You want to, and also create a good, in that sort of case, create a good explanation of what you're doing and why. Because it's the why that's pretty important when it comes to jurisdiction analysis. And so I hope that helps.
And really quick, Michelle, I know we have to end the meeting, but I think that that's really important because a lot of tribal governments actually write that into their codes and ordinances, that they also follow their traditional, cultural, inherent laws. And so that helps encompass what the other written kind of more Western laws that they may be establishing as well.
Okay, this is Bonnie. I just want to say a big thank you, a big pinagigi in my language, in the Ho-Chunk language, to both Michelle and Tammy for that excellent presentation. I learned a lot just listening. And I always realize how much more work we have to do in Alaska. So it inspires me, and at the same time, it's a little frustrating because we haven't done as much as we should have or could have. So I say a big thank you for sharing your knowledge, your wisdom. I really believe in the importance of exercising tribal sovereignty and incorporating our cultural traditions wherever we can, even within our legal system. So it was really good to hear that. So I just wanted to remind our participants that you can request training and technical assistance. You can go to the website at www.tribalresponse.org. And there's a form there where you can request TA that comes directly to us. You can also email us at tribalresponse@tlpi.org. Or you can email me directly. I'm Bonnie at tlpi.org. And on our website, on the www.tribalresponse.org, there's a lot of really excellent resources, and we continue to add them. So that's where the link is to request TA. It's called, what is it called? Request form. So if you click on that, it'll bring you to a form where you can request TA. And again, it's for tribes that do not receive Office on Violence Against Women funding. And these are some of the things that you'll see on the website. Resources that prioritize victim safety, just helping tribes look at how best to do that. Also, offender accountability, and also resources on tribal protection orders. A link to the website that Tammy mentioned, the tribalprotection.org website. So lots of really good resources, and we continue to add those. Also, we have a carousel at the beginning where we add resources on critical issues and also funding opportunities. So again, you can get information there by going on the website. Right now, we have resources related to the current COVID pandemic. So there's resources that have been developed for tribes to address the virus within their community and how it's impacting their communities. So I ask that you check that out. I think you also have some documents that have been attached to the invite, the webinar invite. So there's a PDF on Alaska Tribal Protection Orders. We have a brochure on our initiative. If you want more information, also a letter that went out to tribes about the initiative. So I welcome you to check those out and contact us if you need any kind of training and technical assistance. If you have additional questions that you may have had and didn't get answered or didn't want to ask on the webinar, feel free to contact us. Again, thank you, Michelle and Tammy. Here's the contact information for the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. Their mailing address in Fairbanks, Alaska, their phone number 907-328-3990. And their email addresses, as well as the website, www.aknwrc.org.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Thank you for attending our webinar. Stay safe.